There's a quiet kind of loneliness that rarely gets named. It doesn't come from being excluded. You're invited, you're included, your name is on the list, and yet, somehow, you always feel like you're sitting in the extra chair no one really planned for. You're there when the group gathers. You laugh at the right moments. You listen, you contribute, you show up with warmth and effort. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. No one would ever call you isolated or alone. But inside, there's a subtle awareness you can't shake. If you didn't show up, the conversation would still flow. If you went quiet, no one would quite notice. If you slowly pulled away, there wouldn't be a moment where anyone stopped and asked, "Wait, where did you go?" This isn't the pain of rejection. It's something more confusing than that. It's being present without being essential. Included, but not chosen. Known, but not held in mind. And the hardest part is that you can't point to a single moment where it all went wrong. There was no conflict, no betrayal, no clear reason, just the steady feeling that your seat at the table exists, but it was never meant to be yours. There's a name for this experience, the floater friend, someone who moves easily between groups, liked by many, deeply anchored by few. In this video, we'll explore the psychology behind that invisible role, why it forms, and how belonging quietly shifts from being included to being truly chosen. Let's begin. Being a floater friend doesn't feel dramatic. There's no obvious rejection, no sharp moment where the door closes in your face. Instead, it's a series of small, almost forgettable experiences that quietly add up. It's walking into a group conversation and realizing you missed the beginning and no one thinks to catch you up. You smile, nod, and piece things together from context, always half a step behind. It's laughing at an inside joke you don't fully understand, not because it's funny, but because it's easier than asking for an explanation. It's being in every group chat, yet hesitating when you actually need someone. You scroll through the names, aware that none of them feel like the right one to call, not because they're unkind, but because you're not sure your presence carries enough weight to interrupt their lives. You show up with enthusiasm, you listen closely, you remember details, and when the gathering ends, you leave with a strange emptiness that's hard to justify. Nothing bad happened, everyone was friendly, and yet, something essential was missing. The most disorienting part is the doubt that follows. You start wondering if you're imagining it, if you're being too sensitive. After all, you're included, right? But deep down, you sense the difference between being welcomed and being needed, between being part of the moment and being part of someone's inner circle. And that quiet distinction is what makes the role of the floater friend so hard to name and so hard to shake. Here's what most people get wrong about floater friends. They assume this role comes from social awkwardness, insecurity, or a lack of confidence. But in reality, it's often the opposite. Floater friends are usually highly socially skilled. They know how to read a room within seconds. They sense shifts in tone, notice who's uncomfortable, and instinctively adjust themselves to keep things smooth. They know when to speak, when to soften a comment, when to change the subject so no one feels exposed. Conversations don't collapse around them, they stay balanced. This level of social awareness doesn't come from ease. It comes from attentiveness. Floater friends are often the listeners, the translators, the emotional glue that keeps different personalities from clashing. They're adaptable, flexible, and rarely demanding. Being around them feels safe because they don't create friction or take up too much space. And that's exactly where the misunderstanding begins. Because while this skill makes them pleasant to be around, it also keeps them from being clearly located in the social landscape. They move where they're needed. They fit where there's room. Over time, they become fluid rather than anchored. Most people don't realize how much effort this takes. Constantly adjusting yourself requires energy. It means paying attention not just to what's being said, but to how it's landing. It means quietly managing other people's comfort while minimizing your own impact. And because floater friends do this so seamlessly, their presence starts to feel replaceable. Not because it is, but because it never demands to be acknowledged. Their strength becomes invisible. Their adaptability becomes expected. And without ever intending to, they train others to enjoy their presence without learning how to hold on to it. What looks like effortlessness from the outside is often a refined survival skill on the inside, one that keeps relationships smooth but rarely lets them grow deep. This pattern doesn't appear out of nowhere. Most floater friends didn't wake up one day and decide to stay on the edges of connection. The roots of this role usually reach much further back into moments when belonging felt uncertain. For many, there was a time early in life when emotional safety wasn't guaranteed, not always through obvious trauma, but through inconsistency, affection that depended on mood, attention that came and went, environments where being easy, agreeable, or self-sufficient felt like the safest option. So the nervous system learned something quietly but powerfully. Connection must be maintained, not claimed, not assumed, maintained. You learn to watch first, to sense what others need before expressing what you want, to become adaptable rather than anchored. Over time, being liked starts to feel safer than being known. Harmony feels more reliable than authenticity. This is where social skill becomes strategy. You become someone who blends in, smooths over, and stays emotionally flexible, not because you lack identity, but because showing too much of it once felt risky. Being low maintenance reduced the chances of conflict, rejection, or withdrawal. And the irony is this: the very behaviors that once helped you stay connected are the same ones that now keep you slightly outside of deeper belonging. As an adult, you may no longer be in those early environments, but the pattern remains. Your system still operates as if belonging could disappear at any moment. So it keeps adapting, adjusting, and floating. Not because you don't deserve a place, but because you learned long ago that having one was never guaranteed. Here's the paradox at the center of the floater friend experience, one that most people feel but rarely understand. The more flexible you become, the less clearly you're chosen. When you adapt to every group, shift to match every dynamic, and never ask others to adjust around you, something subtle happens. You stop creating friction, but you also stop creating gravity. There's nothing for others to orient around. Nothing that says, this person has weight here. Belonging doesn't form only through kindness or availability. It forms through presence, through occupying space in a way that's consistent and recognizable. When someone knows where you stand, how you show up, and what it feels like when you're missing, that's when attachment forms. But floater friends often make themselves easy to include. They fit wherever there's room. They don't disrupt plans. They don't demand attention. And because of that, they become the person everyone enjoys, but few would rearrange their lives for. This isn't a moral failure. It's a structural one. When you're always the one adjusting, others never learn how to adjust for you. When you're endlessly accommodating, your absence doesn't create contrast. The group keeps moving, not out of indifference, but because nothing in the system signals that something essential is gone. So the paradox isn't that you're too much, it's that you've made yourself too easy to replace. Not because you are replaceable, but because your flexibility has quietly trained people to experience you as optional rather than anchored. The most difficult part of being a floater friend isn't what happens socially, it's what happens internally over time. Because when you're always included but rarely chosen, the pain doesn't land in obvious ways. There's no clear person to be angry at, no single moment you can point to and say, this is where it broke. Instead, the cost shows up quietly in the way your energy drains faster, in the way socializing starts to feel heavier than it should. You begin to feel tired before plans even start, not because you dislike people, but because you're constantly managing yourself, monitoring the room, adjusting your tone, making sure you don't take up too much space or ask for too much in return. Over time, something more subtle creeps in, self-doubt. You start wondering if the problem is you, if you're too sensitive, if you're imagining the distance. After all, no one is rejecting you outright. Everyone is friendly. So the mind turns inward, searching for flaws. And that's where the real damage happens, because the loneliness of the floater friend isn't loud, it's ambiguous. It lives in unanswered texts that don't quite sting enough to justify feeling hurt. In moments when you realize you're the listener, the supporter, the reliable presence, but rarely the one being leaned on, this kind of loneliness is especially isolating because it's hard to explain. If you try to describe it, it can sound ungrateful, but you have so many friends, and so you learn to carry it quietly. What no one talks about is how this role slowly disconnects you from your own needs. You get so used to adapting that you lose track of what you actually want. You stop expecting to be prioritized. You stop believing your absence would matter, and that erosion, slow, silent, and unseen, is the emotional cost of always floating, never landing. When people talk about feeling invisible in friendships, the advice often comes quickly and confidently. You just need better boundaries. Say no more. Stop overgiving. Cut people off. But for floater friends, this advice usually misses the point. The issue isn't that you don't have boundaries. It's that boundaries alone don't change the role you've been unconsciously playing. You can say no more often and still feel peripheral. You can pull back and still not feel chosen, because the core pattern isn't about access, it's about positioning. Floater friends aren't overextending because they lack self-respect. They're adapting because their nervous system learned that staying flexible kept connection intact. Boundaries address behavior. This pattern lives deeper than behavior. When you suddenly set boundaries without shifting your internal orientation, two things often happen. Either the relationship fades, confirming the fear that closeness was conditional, or the dynamic stays the same, just quieter. You're still present, still agreeable, just less visible. What's missing from the conversation is this: belonging doesn't come from pulling away, it comes from being felt. And being felt requires more than limits. It requires consistency, emotional weight, and the willingness to let others experience you as someone who occupies space, not someone who simply fits into it. That can't be achieved through rules or scripts alone. So the work isn't about becoming colder, stricter, or more guarded. It's about stepping out of the reflex to adapt and into a steadier way of showing up, one that allows others to register you, respond to you, and eventually choose you. Boundaries can protect you, but they can't, by themselves, make you belong. The shift that changes the floater friend pattern isn't loud or dramatic. It doesn't come from reinventing your personality or confronting everyone in your life. In fact, it's so subtle that most people miss it entirely. It begins when you stop adjusting first. Not in anger, not as a test, just as a quiet experiment. You pause before filling silence. You notice the impulse to smooth things over and you let it pass. You allow yourself to take up the same amount of space you naturally would, without shrinking or compensating. This moment is uncomfortable because it goes against everything your system learned about staying connected. There's a fear that if you don't adapt, you'll be left behind, that the room will move on without you. Sometimes it does, and that's part of the shift. Because when you stop floating, you begin to see which connections were built on your flexibility and which ones are able to meet you where you are. You stop earning belonging through effort and start discovering it through presence. This isn't about becoming distant or withholding. It's about becoming consistent. Showing up as the same person, regardless of who's in the room. Letting others feel the contours of you, your pace, your preferences, your limits. At first, the change feels quiet and internal, but over time, it reshapes your relationships. Some grow more grounded, others gently fall away, and in their place, something unfamiliar begins to form. Not constant inclusion, not universal approval, but something far more stabilizing. The experience of being felt, recognized, and slowly chosen. When you've spent a long time floating between people, it's easy to believe that belonging comes from proximity, from being present often, from staying connected everywhere. But real belonging doesn't work that way. Belonging isn't about how many spaces you occupy. It's about whether your presence carries weight in any of them. As the floater pattern loosens, something unexpected often happens. Your circle gets smaller. Not because you're failing socially, but because you're no longer spreading yourself thin to stay included. You begin to notice which connections deepen when you stop performing, and which ones only existed because you made them easy. This can feel like loss at first. Fewer invitations, quieter weekends, more empty space. But inside that space is clarity. You start to recognize the difference between being liked and being held in mind, between familiarity and attachment. Deeper connections don't require constant presence, they require resonance. The sense that if you were missing, something would shift, a conversation would pause, a thought would form around you. Belonging, redefined, isn't about being everywhere, it's about being somewhere fully. And when your presence carries weight, even a few connections can feel steadier than 100 familiar faces. If any part of this video felt uncomfortably familiar, there's a reason for that. The floater friend experience often lives quietly in the background of people's lives, unnamed and unexplained. Many carry it for years, assuming it's just the way relationships work for them. But there's nothing broken about you. You weren't too quiet. You weren't too adaptable. You weren't failing at connection. You learned how to stay connected in the safest way available at the time. That skill helped you survive socially. It helped you belong enough. And now, you're simply outgrowing the role it created. Shifting out of the floater position doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, through awareness, consistency, and allowing yourself to be felt rather than managed. Through letting go of the belief that you must earn closeness by making yourself easy to keep around. And if this video helped you put words to something you've been carrying silently, you don't have to hold it alone. This channel exists to explore the quiet patterns beneath our relationships, the ones that shape how we connect, protect, and heal. If these conversations resonate with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future videos like this. And if you feel comfortable, Share your experience in the comments. Whether you've lived as the floater friend, are moving out of that role, or are just beginning to recognize it, your voice matters here.